Maybe you've heard many stories about the Knights Templar before. Golden treasures, the Holy Grail, even maps to hidden worlds. But tonight, I want to take you down a road less traveled, one that begins not with a shining cup or a mountain of gold, but with a whisper written on crumbling parchment. If you're listening right now, I'll tell you this. The best way to step into this story is simple. Let the world outside slow down a little. Put your phone aside for a while, slip on your headphones, maybe even close your eyes. Let the noise fade, so the echoes of the past can come alive around you. In the quiet town of Tomar, Portugal, long after the Templar had been scattered, monks tending a dusty archive found something strange. A page, almost overlooked, marked with the words Os ossos de Deus, the bones of God. The ink was faded, the hand unfamiliar, but the phrase carried a weight that made them shiver. It wasn't the Grail. It wasn't a relic the Vatican ever catalogued. This was something far more dangerous. You see, the Church had always built its power on mystery and faith. Faith in what could not be touched, weighed, or seen. But what if the Templars had found something that could be touched? Something that had once belonged to Christ in flesh and blood. A relic so tangible, so human, that it could shake the foundations of belief itself. The monks who found that note dared not share it openly. They tucked it away again, as if afraid that even the words could burn. But the whisper lingered. Could the Templars, in their years beneath the Holy Land, have uncovered not just symbols of Christ, but remains? The story begins in Jerusalem, during the fevered days of the Crusades. The Templars were not just warriors. They were diggers, seekers, explorers of the earth beneath the Temple Mount. Chroniclers wrote of tunnels stretching like veins under the holy city. What they were looking for has always been debated. Solomon's treasure, lost scrolls, perhaps even the Ark itself. But another thread suggests something darker, more intimate. That in their search, they unearthed a burial, old and hidden, wrapped in silence since the 1st century. Imagine that for a moment. You're a knight, sworn to protect pilgrims, but also sworn to secrecy by your brothers. In the damp torchlight beneath the Temple Mount, you pry open a stone chamber. Not gold, not jewels. Instead, a box of bones, fragile and pale. One marked with the faint carving of a cross. Would you dare to believe? The record at Tamar hints that someone did believe. Someone thought the Templars had carried away more than manuscripts. A bone, perhaps a fragment of rib, perhaps a finger. Something small, but enough to unsettle heaven and earth. That phrase, the bones of God, would not have been written lightly. For medieval men, it bordered on blasphemy. To even put those words together was dangerous, and yet it was written, tucked away where only the careful would ever find it. The Templars, unlike the Vatican, were practical. They built banks, ships, fortresses. They didn't just pray, they planned. If they had such a relic, they would not have displayed it in gold reliquaries or paraded it through Rome. They would have hidden it, protected it, and sworn oaths over it. Because for them, this was not about spectacle. It was about control. And here's where the story becomes a knife's edge. If the relic existed, it could do two things. Confirm Christ's humanity in a way no gospel ever dared, or strip away the divine mystery the Vatican depended on. And so, if the Templars had it, they were holding a secret that could undo the Church itself. That's why this whisper matters. Not because we can hold the proof today, but because of the fear it inspired. For centuries, the Church feared objects that made the invisible visible, and nothing could be more dangerous than bones. So tonight, as we begin this story, let that phrase echo in your mind, the bones of God. Real or legend, it was enough to send a shiver through history. And the deeper we go, the darker and stranger this trail becomes. When we talk about the Temple Mount, it's easy to picture it as it stands today. Majestic, contested, layered with centuries of prayer and blood. But in the 12th century, for the Templars, it was something else. A labyrinth waiting to be explored. The order had been given quarters right on top of the Temple Mount, in what had once been the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To outsiders, it was a convenient barracks, but to the Templars, it was an invitation. Beneath their feet lay centuries of ruins. Solomon's Temple, Herod's stones, hidden cisterns, forgotten tunnels. And soon, strange rumors began to ripple across Jerusalem. Pilgrims whispered that the knights were digging at night, that under torchlight, stone by stone, they were prying open the city's buried secrets. Why dig? Some said they were searching for the Ark of the Covenant, the chest that once held the tablets of Moses. Others believed they were after Solomon's treasures, gold beyond imagining. But a smaller, more dangerous whisper claimed they were after something else entirely. Evidence of Christ himself. Not just relics like splinters of the true cross or drops of holy blood, which were common across Europe, but something deeper, older, personal. Imagine being a knight in that moment. The clash of swords above ground, the chants of monks in the chapel, and then, below, all silence, broken only by the scrape of iron on stone. One night, perhaps in the 3rd year of their digging, the pick struck something hollow. Beneath the rubble lay a chamber sealed tight, air locked away for 1,000 years. Inside, as the chroniclers later hinted, were fragments, not whole skeletons, but scattered bones, wrapped once in linen that had long since rotted away. To most, they might have been dismissed as ancient remains of some unknown saint. But to a brotherhood obsessed with secrets, even one carved cross on a fragment of rib was enough to change everything. Think of what that meant in their world. The Vatican preached a Christ who had risen, body and soul, into heaven. His bones, therefore, could not remain on earth. If bones were found, it raised a terrible question. Were they proof of his humanity or a challenge to his divinity? For the Templars, sworn to obedience but also trained to think practically, the discovery became both a burden and a weapon. To reveal it would be to destroy the faith of millions. To destroy it would be to erase proof forever. So they chose the third option, to guard it. And this is where the trail leads us back to Tamar. Because centuries later, a monk writing quietly in Portugal scribbled down those words, the bones of God. He must have heard it as rumor, a memory passed down among Templar survivors. Too dangerous to say out loud, but too heavy to forget. Now let's pause here. Imagine you're in their shoes. You're one of a handful of men who know. You've seen the bones, you've touched the box, and you realize this secret could topple Rome, could unravel the church, could make kings tremble. What would you do? Would you hand it to the Pope? Or would you seal it away deeper and deeper, hoping no one would ever find it? That's the dilemma that makes this legend so chilling. It isn't just about what was found. It's about the weight of carrying it. And that weight would shape everything that followed. Because once you hold a secret like this, you cannot simply walk away. The city of Jerusalem was no stranger to secrets, but some were too dangerous even for its walls. The Templars, after years of digging, had stumbled upon something they could neither deny nor destroy. And so the decision was made. It had to be moved. Picture the scene. Acre, the bustling port of the Crusader states, its harbors filled with ships from Genoa, Venice, and beyond. Merchants shouting, camels groaning under loads of spice and silk, and in the middle of this chaos, Templar knights escorting a single, unremarkable crate. To the eyes of the world, it was just another shipment. Wood, iron-bound, sealed with wax. But to those who carried it, the weight felt heavier than gold. They had given it a code name in their ledgers, Arca Negra, the black chest. No one outside their circle could know what it held. The brothers chosen for this task swore oaths in candlelit chapels, oaths sealed with silence. To break them was not just betrayal, but the loss of salvation itself. And yet, even here, whispers followed. Dockworkers muttered about the way the knights' faces looked strained, as if their burden was not the chest, but the knowledge of what lay inside. Some swore they saw a faint glow leaking from the cracks at night, as though the crate itself breathed. The voyage was perilous. Every storm threatened to cast the chest into the sea. Every pirate sail on the horizon threatened exposure. But perhaps the most dangerous enemy was within: doubt. One night, Brother Aemon was said to have asked in the dark of night, "If these are truly the bones of the Savior, how can we mere men keep them from Rome?" His words nearly sparked a mutiny among his brothers, and yet the majority held firm. They argued not in anger, but with fear. Rome, they said, would twist this relic into power. The Pope would not reveal it to the faithful. He would lock it away, or worse, use it as leverage against kings. If Christ's humanity could be proven by these bones, then perhaps the Church's divinity, its claim to stand above all rulers, would crumble. So they carried on, sea spray stinging their eyes, prayers muttered under their breath as the ship pressed westward. Some accounts claim the chest made landfall first in Cyprus, guarded in the commandery at Limassol, before being ferried to Portugal. Others say it went north directly, hidden among relics bound for the cathedrals of France. What we know is this: by the time Acre fell in 1291, when Crusaders fled and the Templar presence in the Holy Land collapsed, the chest was already gone, moved, hidden and guarded in Europe, far from the sands where it was unearthed. And here's the part that haunts historians. Wherever it went, it left no official trace. Templar inventories are meticulous, lists of swords, chalices, even candlesticks, but never the Arca Negra, only scattered notes in the margins of monastic chronicles, mentioning a burden too heavy for parchment. This silence is what makes the legend so powerful. The bones were not paraded, not displayed like trophies. They vanished into shadow, carried by men whose names we may never know. And yet, from that silence grew centuries of rumor. Rumors strong enough that even today we find ourselves wondering, could it be true? Let me ask you, if you were there standing on that dock, would you have noticed anything unusual? Would you have thought twice about a crate being loaded in the night? Or would you, like most, have let it slip by, unaware that history itself was being smuggled under your nose? The Templars made sure of it, and because of that, the bone of God, if it truly existed, was no longer Jerusalem's secret. It was Europe's burden. The black chest did not travel alone forever. In the years after its arrival in Europe, word began to seep through the cracks. A scribe in Cyprus mentioned, "A relic too dangerous for display." A chronicler in Marseille scribbled a cryptic line, "Bones carried not by earth, but by men sworn to silence." It was only a matter of time before whispers reached Rome. The papal court in the late 13th century was a hive of suspicion. Letters came and went daily, sealed with wax and secrecy, carrying tales from every corner of Christendom. Among them was a report that chilled even hardened clerics. The Knights Templar, it said, had unearthed something in Jerusalem and ferried it west. Not gold, not manuscripts, but bones, and not just any bones. The Pope's advisors gathered in the dim light of the Lateran Palace, tapestries heavy on the walls, incense masking the stale air. They debated fiercely. Could such a relic truly exist? Was it possible that Christ, whose resurrection was the foundation of their faith, had left behind earthly remains? Some argued it was blasphemy. Others feared it was worse. Proof that the Church's greatest mystery, the empty tomb, might not have been so empty. But here is where history takes a strange turn. Instead of seizing the chest, instead of parading it as heresy, the Vatican chose silence. Official records note only a brief decree, stamped with the papal seal. Non publicatur, it shall not be published. Why? Because even a whisper could fracture the faithful. The medieval church ruled not only through prayer, but through story. If the story cracked, so too did their power. Better, then, to say nothing. To leave the chest in Templar hands, locked behind monastery walls, than to risk chaos by opening it. For the Templars, this silence was both a blessing and a curse. They could continue their guardianship, but now they knew the truth. Rome was watching. Not openly, not with soldiers at the gates, but with quiet eyes and careful pens. Every move the Templars made, every shipment, every carved symbol might be shadowed by papal spies, and yet the knights did not falter. To them, this relic was not a threat. It was a trust. Something so sacred, so dangerous, that it could never belong to politics. In their chapels, they whispered oaths of guardianship. In their silence, they defied the very city that crowned kings and anointed emperors. This decision, Rome's silence and the Templars' defiance, would shape everything to come. Because silence breeds questions, and questions breed fear. And fear in the hands of power always leads to persecution. So by the end of the 13th century, the chest no longer belonged to Jerusalem or even to the Templars alone. It had become a ghost haunting the corridors of Rome, a secret both sides refused to name. And here's the unsettling thought. Perhaps that is why, when the hammer finally fell on the Templars in 1307, it was not simply about money or kings or papal politics. Perhaps deep down, it was about that chest, the bone of God, and the terror of what might happen if the silence broke. The silence after Rome's decree was heavier than a shout. The Templars, spread across Europe, felt the weight of it pressing down in ways few dared to admit. Outwardly, life went on. Patrols along the roads, ships moving across the Mediterranean, prayers whispered at dawn. But underneath, the order buzzed with an unease they could not shake. For centuries, their strength had come from clarity. Their mission was simple: protect pilgrims, defend the Holy Land, uphold the cross. Yet now they held something no sword could defend and no fortress could contain. The chest, dark, unyielding, whispering of an origin too high and too holy, had created a question the Templars could not answer. Was it proof of God's humanity? Or a temptation planted by the enemy himself? In their commanderies, knights argued in hushed tones. Some believed the relic proved their sacred duty was even greater, that God had chosen them alone as guardians of his earthly remnant. Others feared it was a curse, a test that could undo them if they faltered. Imagine standing in one of their candlelit halls. The air smells of tallow and stone dust. Brothers sit around a long oak table, their white mantles hanging heavy in the chill. One knight leans forward, his voice low. If this is his bone, then we hold the very proof of incarnation. Another slams his fist down, or the very trap that will damn us if we dare to believe it. And all the while, there is the gnawing knowledge that Rome knows. They have said nothing, but their silence is not ignorance. It is surveillance. Spies drift through ports, linger at taverns, pretending to be merchants or scribes. Reports vanish into the papal court like smoke. This is where cracks began to form inside the order itself. Knights who had once marched in absolute unity now carried different interpretations of the same secret. Unity gave way to suspicion. Did that brother truly believe in the oath? Or was he already whispering to Rome? The relic itself was rarely seen. Most brothers never laid eyes on it. Only a handful of masters, priors, and trusted guardians were permitted into the vaults where it rested. To the rest, it was an idea more than an object. And ideas, unlike iron or stone, cannot be locked away. They spread, they divide, they burn. And so the paradox deepened. The Templars' greatest strength was secrecy, but secrecy now became their poison. The more they hid the chest, the more its existence seemed like a shadow creeping along their walls. By the end of that winter, the order was still strong in numbers, still rich in land and gold. But something had shifted. Their prayers were a little more hurried, their trust in each other a little more strained, and in the halls of Rome, parchment was being inked with notes of suspicion and heresy. Because when silence hangs too long, it invites betrayal. And betrayal was already on its way. It always begins with a whisper. Not the kind that carries through the stone corridors of a fortress, but the kind that coils into the ear of a single man who feels he has been overlooked, underpaid, or wronged. Among the ranks of the Templars, discipline was fierce. A knight's life was strict, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But discipline does not erase envy. It does not silence ambition. Picture this: a brother in white mantle kneeling in the chapel at dawn, his lips moving in prayer. But behind his closed eyes, another thought gnaws. Why him, not me? Why do they trust him to guard the chest, while I am sent to the stables? The relic, the bone, was not only a sacred mystery, it became a mirror. Some knights saw in it the face of Christ. Others saw only their own desire for power, for recognition, for escape from a life of anonymity. It was in a coastal commandery, not far from Marseille, that the first letter was written. Simple parchment, folded twice, sealed with red wax. To the outside, it was an innocent report about grain shipments and harbor tolls. But within its margins were coded words, lines that could only be read by those trained to find them. A relic of flesh. A fragment said to be of him. They keep it hidden in the vault, guarded by few, trusted by fewer. That letter traveled quietly, smuggled among crates of wool, slipped into the hands of a Dominican friar known for his sharp tongue and sharper quill. Within weeks, it had reached Rome, and Rome, as always, listened. The Pope's court thrived on such shadows. Informants came cheap, rumors came free. But this rumor was different. It was not about gold hoarded or lands seized. It was about theology made tangible, about a piece of Christ's body existing in the hands of warriors rather than priests. One can almost hear the scratching of the papal secretary's pen as he noted, "If true, this relic destabilizes the church itself. Watch closely." more reports required. Back in the Templar halls, suspicion grew thicker. Some knights noticed their names missing from rosters they once commanded. Others found themselves reassigned to distant outposts. Quiet investigations were underway. The betrayal was still invisible, like smoke in a locked room. But the brothers felt it. Their meals grew quieter. Conversations ended abruptly when a new figure entered. Trust, once as natural as the air they breathed, had been poisoned. And the most dangerous part? No one knew who had spoken. The traitor could be any of them. So the relic, once a symbol of divine guardianship, became a wedge. It drove men apart. It made them look sideways at their own brothers. And all the while in Rome, parchment piled higher, stamped with the seal of the fisherman's ring. The iron seal had not yet been forged, but the whispers that would lead to it had already begun. Imagine a fortress at dusk. The sea wind rattles the banners with red crosses, and torches hiss against the salt air. Inside, the Templars move like clockwork, armor polished, prayers chanted, drills completed with precision. But under that order, a fracture widened. It was no longer just whispers. Rome had already taken its first step. The papal court did not move armies right away. That would have been too loud, too obvious. Instead, it sent men who carried no swords at all. Men who wore the humble black and white of the Dominican order or the coarse robes of Franciscan friars. They arrived as confessors, scribes, and spiritual advisors, but their true mission was far more dangerous: to watch, to listen, and to report. One such man, Brother Matteo, entered the commandery of La Rochelle under the guise of a confessor for the knights preparing to sail. His words were gentle, his prayers precise, his eyes always lowered in humility. And yet, behind that lowered gaze, he measured everything. Who lingered near the vault, who bristled at questions, who stumbled when asked about holy relics. The knights themselves felt the noose tightening, though they could not name it. They had welcomed priests into their halls for centuries, but this was different. The air changed. The very act of kneeling in confession felt heavier, as if each whispered sin might be carried out of the chapel and straight into the Pope's ear. The relic itself, the bone, was now moved more frequently. No chest stayed in one place for too long. Some nights it lay beneath the chapel, beneath a slab carved with the lamb and cross. Other nights it was hidden in the stables, wrapped in cloth that smelled of hay and horse sweat. They had become nomads even within their own walls, always shifting, always fearing. And then came the first trap. A knight, young and eager, confessed in trembling tones that he had dreamed of the relic glowing in the dark. The friar pressed him. "Did you touch it? Did you see it unwrapped?" When the boy said no, the friar nodded. But by dawn, that boy had been summoned to answer questions before his commander. His words had already traveled further than he could imagine. What Rome could not find in documents, it tried to pull from the mouths of men. But still, nothing concrete surfaced, only hints, only shadows. And shadows, dangerous as they were not yet proof. Inside the order, trust bled away. Who among them had spoken to the friars? Who had written letters to Rome? The more the Pope pressed, the more the Templars closed ranks, and the more isolated they became. The irony was bitter. The relic they believed was divine was supposed to unite them in purpose. Instead, it became the very thing that made them look at one another with suspicion. By the time Rome received its fifth letter, describing the bone of the Nazarene with tantalizing certainty, the decision had already been made. The Templars would not just be watched, they would be hunted. And in the shadows of those first reports lay the seed of what history remembers as October 1307. In Rome, parchment whispered more loudly than swords. Letters stamped with wax seals piled upon one another. Reports from France, from Cyprus, from the ports of Portugal. Each scrap of ink told the same haunting tale. The Templars kept something they would not name. A bone, a relic, a fragment said to carry the breath of Christ himself. Pope Clement sat beneath the towering frescoes of the papal chamber, his advisors circling like ravens. They read the reports aloud, their voices echoing off stone walls. They guard it with prayers deeper than for the Eucharist. They shift it nightly, as though it breathes. One knight swore it pulsed in his hands. None of it was proof, and yet to the Vatican it was more dangerous than proof. It was rumor with teeth. Rumor could erode faith faster than heresy itself. The Pope's dilemma was cruel. If the relic truly existed and was shown to the world, then Rome risked losing its throne. Imagine for a moment, if pilgrims could kneel not before altars in cathedrals, but before a bone said to carry the very essence of God. The center of Christendom would shift overnight, from the Vatican to the vault of the temple. So Clement chose silence, but silence sharpened into strategy. He summoned not armies, but record keepers, not swordsmen, but scribes. A commission was formed, its purpose hidden beneath layers of Latin phrases, non publicetur, sed notetur, do not publish, but record. The Vatican would not yet cry heresy, for fear of igniting sympathy for the knights. Instead, it began building a ledger of sins. Accusations half true, stories bent into shape, confessions pulled under pressure. Each line was a brick, each parchment a stone, constructing the prison before it was ever built. Meanwhile, in Paris, Philip the Vauthern, the king who saw gold in every shadow, was fed these whispers like kindling to a fire. The Pope's reports reached his court, and his eyes gleamed. For Philip, the relic was not a threat to faith, but a treasure to be seized. The net was tightening, thread by thread. A friar's testimony in Aragon, a letter from a portmaster in Marseille, a rumor carried from a drunken knight in Cyprus, they all joined into a single fabric. And at the heart of it was a question Rome dared not put into ink. What if the relic truly is what they say? What if the knights cradle the very bones of God? By the close of that year, orders were whispered to trusted agents. Mark the names of those closest to the relic. Trace the routes of their convoys. Follow the wagons at night. The Pope had not yet raised the hammer, but the anvil was waiting, and the knights, still proud, still certain of their vow, did not yet see the trap. Picture the harbor of Acre in the final days before its fall. The Crusader stronghold groaned under the weight of siege, flames licking its outer walls, and the scent of salt mixing with smoke. Amid the chaos of merchants scrambling to flee and soldiers preparing to die, a different kind of movement stirred in the shadows. Down by the waterline, long after midnight, a band of Templars carried a chest. It was no larger than a coffin for a child, bound with iron clasps, wrapped in plain wool cloth. To the untrained eye, it looked like provisions, grain, maybe, or tools. But those who carried it did so with a reverence that betrayed its weight, as though every step risked shattering something more than wood. The waves slapped against the hulls of waiting ships. Lanterns swayed, their light barely reaching the hooded faces of the knights. One of them whispered a prayer, not of victory or vengeance, but of endurance. Another pressed his hand against the chest, as if to steady it, and for a brief moment, his fingers recoiled. Later, he would swear that the iron had grown warm under his touch. The ship chosen was not the largest galleon, nor the swiftest galley. It was an ordinary vessel, a merchant craft disguised with sails patched and decks cluttered with crates. To anyone watching, it looked unworthy of carrying treasure. But that was the point. As the chest was lowered into the hold, an older knight muttered, "The sea is safer than the stone." He meant Jerusalem. He meant Acre. He meant every fortress that had already proven it could fall. The ocean, unpredictable as it was, at least offered anonymity. By dawn, Acre still stood, but barely. From the walls, smoke curled upward like black fingers grasping at the sky, and already, that little ship was out on the horizon, its sails catching a fragile wind, carrying with it the secret no fortress could hold. Where was it bound? Some chronicles whisper Cyprus, others suggest Portugal. A few bolder tales claim it was not bound for Europe at all, but westward, into waters maps had not yet named. And here is where the mystery deepens. There are records, scattered, incomplete, that a vessel matching its description never arrived in Cyprus. Nor did it dock in Marseille, nor Lisbon. It simply disappeared. So what do we make of that? Did it sink beneath the waves, taking the relic to the bottom of the sea? Or did it slip into a harbor where loyal allies hid it in vaults we've long forgotten? Imagine, for a moment, standing on that deck. The night is endless, the stars cold, the chest silent. You're one of the men sworn to guard it, knowing it may cost your life. Would you feel pride or terror? The ship vanished into history, leaving only questions behind. But one thing is certain. This voyage marked the first time the bone of God was untethered from the Holy Land. From then on, its story would belong not to Jerusalem, but to the seas and the secrets they carried. By the time the ship slipped past the shores of Acre, word had already begun to ripple across Christendom. Not every secret dies quietly, and this one was too heavy, too strange to vanish without whispers. Somewhere in Rome, a scribe loyal to the Curia scribbled a line into a private note. The Knights of the Temple carry not gold, but bone. To the Vatican, bone meant relic, and relic meant power. If what the Templars guarded truly was what rumor claimed, a fragment of the very body of Christ, then it was no simple treasure. It was a challenge to Rome's authority. For if God's presence could be kept in a chest under Templar watch, who then needed the Pope's blessing? But how had the Vatican heard so quickly? The answer lies in shadows. The Templars were not the only ones with networks of spies. Merchants loyal to Genoa, envoys passing through Acre, even a deserter knight whose debts had grown too large. Each thread wove into a net that carried whispers back to Rome. Out at sea, the ship's crew had no illusions of safety. Each time the horizon darkened with another vessel, the knights braced. Was it Saracens trailing them? Pirates hungry for plunder? Or worse, Christian allies under secret orders from the Curia, tasked with reclaiming the chest for Rome. One story says that off the coast of Cyprus, a sleek galley gave chase. Its sails bore no cross, no emblem, only plain canvas, too plain to be trusted. For 2 nights it stalked the Templar ship, always keeping distance, always there when the moon rose. Then, on the 3rd dawn, it vanished. Some say it turned back, satisfied that its message, that they were being watched, had been delivered. Others claim the sea swallowed it whole. Inside the hold, the chest remained silent, bound in chains that rattled softly with each wave. And yet, there are records in a Portuguese chronicle centuries later, claiming that one knight awoke during the voyage to see the iron glowing faintly in the dark, as though lit from within. he swore he heard a sound. Not words, but something like a heartbeat. If true, then perhaps the relic itself was restless. Perhaps it knew it had left the Holy Land, and that the eyes of kings, popes, and traitors now hunted it. The Vatican's dilemma was clear. If the Templars kept such a relic, Rome's supremacy could crack. But striking openly against the order too soon risked turning the faithful against the Church. And so, the Curia's weapon was patience. Let the knights carry it. Let them feel safe. And let the secret grow too large to hide. Because once it grew large enough, all Rome would need was a spark to burn them. When the Templar ship finally reached the harbor of Cyprus, its sails were torn, its hull scarred by storms, and its crew gaunt from sleepless nights. Yet according to the records that survive, the chest, their forbidden cargo, was still aboard. But here is where the story fractures. One strand of chronicles, whispered by clerics loyal to Rome, says the chest was carried off under the cover of darkness, loaded onto another vessel bound for Italy. They claim a hand from the Vatican itself was waiting, and that the relic was quietly returned to papal vaults, never to be seen again. Another tale, preserved in Portuguese tradition, insists the chest never touched Roman soil. Instead, it was entrusted to a select band of knights and ferried west, toward Lisbon, where the order had deep roots and loyal commanderies. There, it was hidden in the fortress of Tamar, within walls so thick that even centuries of cannon fire could not break them. And then, there's a third version, the one that keeps historians and dreamers awake. This account says the ship never made port at all, that in the dead of night, when lightning split the horizon, the vessel disappeared. Some fishermen swore they saw it vanish into a curtain of fog, its lanterns flickering once and then gone forever. No wreckage washed ashore, no bodies, only silence. So which is true? Did the relic arrive in Rome, strengthening the Vatican's grip? Did it slip into Portugal, forming the hidden heart of the Templars' later Order of Christ? Or did it sink into the sea, claimed by the deep, waiting for divers or dreamers to stumble across it centuries later? The truth may never be known. But one fact stands above the noise. After Acre fell and the ship departed, the Templars changed. Their secrecy deepened, their wealth multiplied, and their loyalty to Rome began to crack. Perhaps because they were no longer guardians of gold, but of something far more dangerous. And with that shift came the inevitable. If the relic survived the crossing, then it would not only haunt the Templars, it would haunt Christendom itself. Rome in the early 14th century was a city of both splendor and rot. Pilgrims still filled its basilicas, offering prayers at the tombs of saints. But behind marble columns and gilded altars, whispers traveled faster than prayers. Whispers that the Knights Templar had brought back not just treasure from the East, but something that could undo the Church itself. Clerics recorded a strange phrase in their marginal notes, Ossa Domini, the bones of the Lord. To most, it sounded like blasphemy. To the higher councils, it sounded like danger. Because if even the rumor of Christ's bones existing were true, it would strike at the core of their teaching, the resurrection. Imagine, for a moment, being a bishop in Rome and hearing that armored monks, wealthy beyond kings, were guarding a chest that might contain the unthinkable. How do you control belief if belief itself could be disproven? The Pope's advisors grew restless. Some argued the relic must be seized at once, hidden deep in Vatican vaults, erased from memory. Others counseled caution, because to confront the Templars too boldly was to risk rebellion. After all, The order had castles stretching from Jerusalem to Portugal, war horses trained for battle, and coffers fattened by Europe's nobles. So Rome chose a third path. They would watch. They would send envoys and spies to Templar commanderies, listening for signs, waiting for slips of the tongue. They even pressed confessors, the priests who heard the knights' sins in secrecy, to report back anything unusual. But the Templars were disciplined. If they had the chest, they did not speak of it. Instead, they doubled down on rituals, guarded halls with silence, and masked their true work behind layers of prayer and charity. And yet, hints leaked. A report to the Pope spoke of a sealed chamber in Tamar, where no servant was ever allowed. Another claimed knights in Scotland lit candles around an empty sarcophagus every Good Friday, whispering verses not found in any gospel. Were these simply pious customs, or the smoke of a much darker fire? Rome could not know. And that uncertainty was the seed of fear. For if the Templars truly guarded a fragment of Christ, then the Church's authority no longer rested on altars in Rome, but on a chest locked away in the hands of warrior monks, and that, to the Pope, was unacceptable. The Vatican was never short of eyes. Rome had always thrived on rumor, and when rumor wasn't enough, coin would loosen tongues. By the early 1300s, Pope Clement V quietly authorized what his clerks called custodes invisibiles, invisible guardians. But these guardians were not there to protect. They were watchers, infiltrators, men trained to blend into the shadows of Templar strongholds. Their first targets were not knights themselves, but the people who orbited them. Cooks, grooms, masons, even the scribes who copied ledgers. If a Templar fortress had a beating heart of secrecy, these ordinary hands brushed against it daily. A kitchen boy in Paris swore that every winter's end, knights carried a chest into the chapel and sealed themselves inside until dawn. A mason in Portugal whispered of carving stone niches that were never meant for windows or tombs, but for hiding something too holy or too dangerous for daylight. Reports dripped back to Rome like water through cracks. Each one was small, perhaps meaningless in isolation. But together, they painted a picture that chilled the papal court. The Templars were guarding something physical, something they treated not as symbol, but as reality. And so Rome pressed harder. Priests assigned to hear knights' confessions were secretly ordered to betray the seal of the confessional. Some refused. Others, out of fear or loyalty to the Pope, yielded. From those whispers came strange fragments. A knight murmuring of ossis salvatoris, the bone of the Savior. Another confessing he had doubted whether they were safeguarding a relic of faith, or a relic that would undo faith. But the more the Vatican tried to tighten its grip, the more the Templars closed ranks. Meetings once open became secret councils. Chapels, once accessible only to brethren, now barred even friendly clergy. And knights took new oaths. Oaths that sounded less like military vows and more like guards set against Rome itself. Still, one slip changed everything. In 1305, an envoy in Paris bribed a young scribe in the Templar treasury. The boy swore he had once glimpsed a document sealed with the Red Cross, describing a reliquary of wood and silver, within which lay a fragment said to shine faintly in the dark. He did not know if it was true, or if the words were only for ceremony. But to Clement's advisors, it was enough. The Church had always feared heresy from the outside: Saracens, Cathars, pagans. Now it seemed the greatest heresy might be locked inside the very order sworn to defend Christianity, and with that, the Vatican made its decision. Watching was no longer enough. The next step would be confrontation. Trust had always been the marrow of the Templar order. They rode together, bled together, prayed together. For a knight to break faith with his brothers was almost unthinkable. And yet, history teaches us. Betrayal never comes from strangers. It comes from those closest to the fire. The Vatican spies knew this. They no longer bribed cooks or scribes alone. They went after men with white mantles, men who had once sworn to protect Jerusalem, but now found themselves far from the Holy Land, restless, weary, and wondering if God had truly abandoned their cause. One name emerges from the shadows: Hugo de Morlaix. He was not a Grand Master or even a commander, just a knight stationed in Paris. Accounts differ, but some say he grew bitter after being passed over for promotion. Others whisper he feared exposure, gambling debts, a woman in secret, maybe both. Whatever the truth, he agreed to speak to Rome. His testimony was laced with half-truths, exaggerations, and perhaps outright lies. He claimed the brothers bowed to a head-like relic in candlelit rites. He said he overheard murmurs of ossus Domini, the bone of the Lord. He did not know if it was a femur, a rib, or a fragment of something even stranger, but the phrase alone was dynamite in the papal court. And once the first stone was cast, others followed. Knights under pressure confessed to small indiscretions, then were coaxed into weaving stories the inquisitors wanted to hear. Some recanted, some held firm, and a few broke completely. The order that once stood united in silence now had fissures Rome could exploit. The most dangerous thing, though, was not the words themselves. It was the idea. Once even a handful of Templars admitted to guarding a relic that might have been the physical remains of Christ. The Vatican didn't need full proof. Doubt was enough. Doubt eroded loyalty from the inside, setting brother against brother. Imagine the atmosphere in those fortresses. Candlelight flickering on stone walls. Brothers eyeing one another during meals. Conversations cut short when footsteps approached. For the first time, silence was no longer a shield. It was a threat. And outside the fortress walls, the world was shifting too. Kings like Philip IV of France saw opportunity. If whispers of heresy could be magnified, if Rome could be convinced the Templars were hiding not just treasure but blasphemy, then their lands, gold, and power could be seized in the name of purity. The dominoes had begun to fall, not by sword, but by whispered betrayal. In Avignon, the papal court had grown heavy with incense and intrigue. Pope Clement V sat not as a free shepherd, but as a man balanced on a razor's edge. The French king, Philip IV, pressed from one side, hungry for the Templars' wealth. On the other, the order's sheer power and prestige still made them dangerous to condemn without cause. That's when the first reports arrived. Not in grand proclamations, but in thin letters sealed in wax, slipped quietly onto the papal desk. Each one carried testimony from a knight, a sergeant, or even a servant, men who had spoken under pressure, or perhaps for silver. And in those letters ran a thread of poison. Talk of a hidden relic called ossus Domini, the bone of the Lord. Clement read them with trembling hands. If the claim was false, it was slander of the highest order. But if it held even a grain of truth, then Rome faced a crisis beyond politics. For if the Templars really guarded a piece of Christ's body, then what was left of the Church's authority? How could a pope claim to hold the keys of heaven when flesh and bone proof of God walked in another man's chest? The cardinals whispered among themselves, some arguing for caution, others for swift judgment. One suggested sending agents to verify. Another said the relic, if real, must be seized at any cost. because power like that could not remain in the hands of warrior monks. And Clement, poor Clement, leaned back on his chair, knowing every choice would stain him. To ignore the rumors was to look weak before Philip. To pursue them was to risk tearing Christendom apart. Yet the whispers grew louder. Soon, the Pope could not tell where truth ended and invention began. Outside Avignon, word spread like wildfire. Merchants repeated it in taverns, priests hushed it in confessionals, even rival orders pricked their ears. What if the Templars had indeed taken something from Jerusalem's ruins that was never meant to leave the Holy Land? In that moment, the Vatican's silence became its guilt. For when a story is too dangerous to deny, it begins to live a life of its own. And so the stage was set. What began as rumors in fortress halls had now become a weapon in the Pope's court. A relic, real or imagined, would soon be the justification for the greatest betrayal in medieval Christendom. Legends say that when the Templars carried their most dangerous secret out of Jerusalem, it wasn't only gold, parchments, or relics. Hidden among the crates and sealed chests was something living, a child. Not just any child, but one whispered to carry a trace of Solomon's bloodline, a fragile heir protected in shadows. To the Knights, this child was as sacred as any relic, because if the bones of Christ were a reminder of divinity, then a living bloodline tied to God's chosen king was proof of continuity. Together, the relic and the child became two halves of a dangerous truth: flesh that had died and flesh that lived on. The order sheltered the child under layers of disguise. They gave him a saint's name, erased his origins, and raised him not in the grand halls of Paris or Jerusalem, but in outlying commanderies where the Vatican's eyes rarely looked. The boy was taught to ride, to pray, to speak in riddles. He grew up not knowing his true worth, but every knight around him guarded him as if he were the Grail itself. And yet, secrets this heavy never stay buried. The Vatican's spies began to notice strange movements. Knights assigned to distant castles with no clear reason, meals prepared with Levantine spices in northern Europe, the same carved sigils appearing in both Scotland and Portugal. They suspected a pattern, a web meant to hide something greater than coin. Here lies the twist. If the Templars really had the bone of God, then raising a child of Solomon alongside it wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. A relic of Christ bound to a living heir meant legitimacy beyond papal reach. It meant a vision of Christianity not anchored in Rome, but in an older, more dangerous promise. Now imagine you're one of those knights. Every night you kneel in a cold stone chapel, hearing the boy's footsteps echo in the halls. Do you believe you're protecting the future of the faith, or endangering it? Would you hand him to the Pope or hide him from the world forever? The Vatican feared that answer, and so quietly, they began plotting not just against the relic, but against the child. Because if either survived, relic or heir, the Church's throne would never rest steady again. The Vatican rarely acted openly in the 12th century. It preferred whispers to swords, parchments to spears. But when word reached Rome that a child was being hidden by the Templars, an heir tied to Solomon's bloodline, the whispers turned into something darker. An assassin was sent. Not dressed as a knight, not bearing papal seals. No, the Church worked more subtly. The man came as a pilgrim, a weary traveler claiming to seek bread and shelter at a Templar commandery near the Rhine. His sandals were torn, his eyes hollow, his story convincing. The knights, bound by vows of charity, welcomed him in. They gave him broth, a place by the fire. But that night, While the boy slept under a thin blanket, the pilgrim slipped through the halls carrying a dagger tipped with poison. What happened next became the stuff of whispered legend. Some say a Templar knight had been restless, unable to sleep, and walked the corridors in prayer. Others tell of a hound that barked at the intruder. Whatever the truth, the assassin never reached the boy. He was found at dawn, collapsed in the chapel, dagger still in hand. Some claimed the very relic, the bone of God, hidden within the keep, had emitted a light that froze him in his tracks. The Templars did not speak of the attempt. Instead, they told the boy a story, that God had sent angels to protect him. To the child, it became a lesson in faith. To the knights, it was a warning. The Vatican would never stop hunting. And yet, here's the twist that makes the tale linger. One of the Vatican's own scribes, who secretly admired the Templars, left a note in the margins of a manuscript. The boy lives. The relic glows. Rome trembles. It's just one line, hidden in a library most people never see. But when historians stumbled on it centuries later, they began to ask, what exactly had the Vatican feared so much that they would risk such betrayal of their own sacred vows? And if this was the first attempt, how many more followed? Unrecorded, unseen, buried under centuries of silence. When the danger grew too close, the Templars did what they had always done best. They moved quietly, swiftly, and without leaving a trace. The boy, the supposed heir of Solomon, and the mysterious relic they called the Bone of God could not remain in Central Europe. Too many spies, too many eyes. The Vatican's reach stretched far, and every monastery, every abbey, could be a listening post. So the Templars chose exile, but not abandonment. Two paths were carved, like twin rivers splitting at a mountain. One river flowed north, to the misty highlands of Scotland. The other west to Portugal, where the Order of Christ would later rise from the ashes of the Templar suppression. In Scotland, they found refuge with families already tied to the land, but sympathetic to their cause. Castles at the edges of the Isles, churches built of stone so dark they seemed to swallow the light. These became hiding places. One chapel in particular, Rosslyn, would centuries later bear carvings that scholars still argue over. Knots that resembled the seal of Solomon, vines that curled into shapes too deliberate to be mere decoration. Was it art, or was it a coded message to keep watch over the hidden lineage? Meanwhile, in Portugal, the Templars found something else, a kingdom eager for expansion and discovery. There, under the protection of kings who valued their ships and their gold, they disguised their brotherhood as the Order of Christ. Outwardly loyal to the Pope, inwardly still guarding the forbidden secret. And in the vaults of Tomar, Portugal, whispers say a chest was kept. Iron-bound, heavy, never opened except in the presence of a few trusted knights. Inside, perhaps, was the relic itself. Here's where the story gains its human edge. Imagine a young knight sworn to protect this secret. He looks at the boy, playing with wooden toys in the courtyard, and he wonders, am I protecting a future king? Or a myth that could tear Christendom apart? That tension, faith against doubt, loyalty against fear, was the burden every Templar carried. And yet, despite all risks, they kept their oath. They split the secret in two, planting roots in the north and west, so that even if one branch were cut down, the other might survive. It's a brilliant move, like a chess master sacrificing pieces to save the king. And it raises a haunting question for us. If the lineage really survived in Scotland and Portugal, what traces might still linger today? hidden in names, in bloodlines, in symbols carved into stone. In Scotland, the stone blocks of Rosslyn Chapel are not mere decoration. It is said that if you stand in the winter morning light, when the sun strikes the window at just the right angle, a carving appears like a double helix. Not everyone notices, but to the Templars it was a sign to remind one another. The bloodline is alive. Likewise, in Tomar, the reliefs on the monastery walls seem at first to be only floral motifs, but when you piece the details together, they form the shape of Solomon's knot, an ancient symbol found in both Jewish and Arab engravings. The Templars left ciphers not in letters, but in stone, wood, and glass. Try to imagine, if you were a knight living in an age of persecution, when any document could easily be burned and any words easily coerced, the only means left would be art. A stained glass panel, a symbol carved in a chapel, silent things that nonetheless whisper to those taught to understand. They say that at wine feasts after the rites, a knight would never speak the name, the bloodline, outright, but would simply raise his hand in the sign of a knot, like a fishhook traced in the air. A small gesture, enough for the man across the table to understand. The secret is kept. In both Scotland and Portugal, those signs seeped into everyday life. Some families began using compound surnames with roots in the Levant. Some dishes took on herbs unfamiliar in Europe. All of it like social genetic codes, just enough to endure, but not so conspicuous as to arouse Vatican suspicion. What astonishes us is how the Templars held the balance. They were silent, yet they never let the secret die. It was not only an oath, but a hidden system of transmission, a language that needed no writing. And here we meet a paradox. The more silent the silence, the louder the secret reverberates. For as the centuries pass, more and more people begin to ask, what do these symbols mean? Not all Templars were warriors on silver-armored horses. There was a special class seldom mentioned, those whom their brothers quietly called custodes taciti, that is, keepers of silence. They carried no great sword or brightly colored cloak. They were often monks, carvers, even masons, people discreet enough to vanish into a crowd. Their task was not to fight, but to keep. Part of that meant guarding small objects, a little gem engraved with Hebrew letters, a genealogy written on sheepskin. But the greater part was the keeping of memory. In Tomar, they say that in a small chapel there was a monk who never left the candle before the altar. He lived, ate, and prayed there, so that whenever a new knight was ordained, he would whisper a short sentence. Lineage of Solomon is alive. No records, no proofs, only the spoken word. In Scotland, the keepers of silence chose another way. They sent signals down the generations. A relief retouched whenever it was damaged. A fairy tale told to children, but deftly threaded with a strange name. Those small details tied the secret across the centuries. You may wonder, were they ever afraid? Of course. Afraid of exposure, of arrest, of discovery by the Vatican. Yet, astonishingly, they kept their vows. When questioned, they only shook their heads. When tortured, they preferred the blows to speaking. One story survives from the 15th century. A stone carver at Rosslyn fell under suspicion of knowing too much. The magistrate forced him to confess. He kept silent. Before he died, he drew Solomon's knot with charcoal ash on the floor of his cell and left it there. When the jailer entered, he had already stopped breathing, but the sign remained. If you stood in their place, knowing a secret that could rock the papal throne, would you keep silent or speak to save your life, and it is thanks to those keepers of silence that the secret did not fade. The signs in stone, the whispers, the half-true, half-legend tales, all stand witness to a bloodline that perhaps no one has proved, yet no one has dared to deny. When words were too dangerous, the Templars spoke in stone, glass, and color, a silent language carved into the world around them. In the churches of Portugal and the shadowy chapels of Scotland, symbols began to appear, shapes and patterns so subtle that only the initiated would notice. To the average worshipper, they were beautiful decorations. To a Templar, they were a map, a reminder, a whisper of an oath that still bound them. One of the most haunting symbols was the interlaced Knot of Solomon. You can still find it today, carved into Rosslyn Chapel, woven into arches where sunlight breaks through stained glass. The knot had no beginning and no end, a sign of continuity, of something that would not be broken by kings or popes. Another was the Black Madonna. Statues of her appeared in places tied to Templar strongholds, her gaze calm but almost knowing. To some she was the Virgin Mary, but to those who carried the lineage secret, she was a cipher, an image of survival hidden in plain sight. Everywhere the Templars went, their art became their code. 7 pointed stars etched onto windows, columns that didn't quite match, as if to say, "Look closer, there is meaning here." Imagine walking into one of these chapels at night, torchlight dancing on walls carved centuries ago, and realizing the stones themselves are speaking. Not with words, but with echoes of a brotherhood who vowed never to let their secret die. And here's the question for you. If you saw one of these symbols today, would you even recognize it? Or has time buried their meaning too deeply for us to see? The thing about the Templars is that they didn't just carve symbols for beauty. They carved them for survival. Every mark was a lifeline, a way to say, "We were here, and we still guard what the world must not know." In Tomar, Portugal, the great convent of Christ holds a hall whose walls twist with spirals and knots that seem almost alive. Step closer, and the lines circle into forms that echo the serpent crown of Solomon itself. Was it coincidence? Or a warning that the bloodline they protected carried weight far older than Christendom? In Rosslyn Chapel, Scotland, the symbols go further. Carvings of maize and aloe, plants unknown in Europe before Columbus, suggest someone had already carried secrets across the ocean. And hidden among those vines are stars and crosses that don't belong to Catholic tradition. To the common eye, just decoration. To a brother knight, a message. The lineage continues. The Black Madonna, placed in dark corners of these sanctuaries, was more than an icon of devotion. Her shadowed face whispered of a truth inverted, a story hidden inside another. Those who knew how to look saw her as a guardian, watching over a child of flesh and blood whose existence could upend the papal throne. The genius was that these symbols were both sacred and invisible. A villager could pray beneath them, never knowing their layered meaning. But a Templar, even one who had been forced underground after 1307, could step into that same chapel and read the message instantly. Think about that. Imagine walking into a church today, one you've visited 100 times, and suddenly realizing the arches, the statues, the stained glass. It's all telling a story no one ever explained to you. Would you feel wonder or fear? The Templars counted on that feeling. It was their shield, their way to carry the forbidden relic, the bone of God, through generations without a single word written on paper. Because words could be burned, but stone endures. When the Templars were scattered after 1307, many believed the Brotherhood had died with them. But the truth is, a brotherhood that has sworn itself to silence does not vanish. It adapts. The bone of God could not be carried openly, but it could be hidden inside a living network of guardians who knew exactly what to look for. Every commandery, every chapel, every estate they had once built became more than property. They became safe houses in a map drawn not on parchment, but in memory. A knight fleeing from France to Portugal knew which symbols to trust on a roadside chapel, which merchant's door would bear the subtle mark of protection, which monastery bell would ring twice at midnight if danger was near. That network was held together by trust and blood. Sons of knights, nephews, cousins were quietly initiated, not with grand ceremonies, but whispered oaths under candlelight. The relic was never shown to all, only hinted at. Yet the story of it, the bone that could shatter faith or prove it, flowed through their veins as surely as their family names. In Scotland, entire clans grew around the idea that their ancestors had once guarded something too powerful for the Pope to hold. In Portugal, the Order of Christ became a mask, knights who had sworn to Rome on the surface, but who still spoke the old language of signs beneath frescoes and altars. And what held them together was not just loyalty to one another. It was fear. The Vatican might not have spoken openly about the relic, but their spies whispered in every court. To slip was death. So the network became tighter, more subtle, more invisible with each generation. Imagine it. Walking through Europe in the 1400s, not knowing that the man selling you salt, the mason carving a column, the captain of a small fishing boat, all might be part of a chain that stretched back to the Temple Mount itself. None of them would admit it. Few of them ever even saw the relic, but every one of them lived as if the future of faith itself depended on their silence. And in a way, it did. Because if the bone truly was what the whispers claimed, if it was a relic that could redefine who Christ was, or whether his body ever left the earth, then their silence was not just survival. It was the thin thread holding up the entire world. By the late 15th century, Europe was trembling on the edge of something new. Caravels lined the docks of Lisbon, sails catching the wind like eager wings, and rumors traveled faster than the ships themselves. Most people spoke of gold, spices, and new lands, but in the hidden circles of Templar bloodlines, there was another whisper. The relic has sailed west. The Order of Christ, Portugal's reborn Templars, were no ordinary navigators. They were cartographers of secrets, men who read not only the stars, but the silent instructions left in stone and symbol. Some chroniclers claim Henry the Navigator was guided by more than curiosity. In the vaults of Tomar, beneath the round church shaped after Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, maps were said to have been drawn long before Columbus. Maps not of the East, but of a vast ocean and the lands beyond. Why would sailors sworn to Christ cross an ocean no one was certain could be crossed? Because the relic had to be hidden where no pope, no king, no rival order could reach. To protect the bone of God meant outpacing the Vatican's spies. And what safer vault than an undiscovered continent? Legends drifted back with the tide. A strange carved box spotted on a remote island, guarded not by locals but by men who bore crosses on their cloaks. Fishermen swore they saw sails with crimson marks vanish into fog and never return. Even among Columbus's men, whispers spread of knights who had come before us. Could it be true? Did the guardians of the forbidden relic reach the Americas before history admits? Some historians dismiss it as myth, pointing to the lack of hard proof. But remember, Silence was the Templars' most powerful weapon. If their relic was hidden across the ocean, then we would expect exactly this. Rumors, fragments, and shadows, but no open confession. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. When you look at old maps from the 1400s, you sometimes find shapes, rough sketches of coasts that should not have been known. A hint of a continent drawn decades too early. Was this cartographic mistake? Or the faint echo of a voyage that carried not gold, not silk, but a relic that could shake Christendom itself? Because if the bone of God crossed the Atlantic, it wasn't just geography that changed. It was faith itself, carried on salt air and hidden in a new world's soil. Back in Rome, the corridors of the Vatican were never silent. Messengers carried news from every port, every court, every monastery where whispers turned into suspicion. It was in these marble halls that a troubling report arrived. Sailors out of Portugal spoke of voyages guided by charts older than any known. One letter, intercepted from a merchant in Madeira, even suggested that the Knights of the Old Cross had taken something sacred far across the ocean. To the average cleric, these were sailors' tales, salt-sprayed exaggerations after too much wine. But to the Pope's inner circle, the words carried a chill. If true, the Templars, or rather their shadow through the Order of Christ, had not only survived, they had escaped Rome's grasp entirely. Worse still, if they carried the relic with them, the Church's most dangerous problem was no longer in Europe. It had sailed beyond the Pope's reach. A cardinal named Vincenzo di Borgia, no stranger to intrigue, was said to have kept a private dossier titled Relictium Transmarinus, the relic overseas. In its notes, he wrote of an ivory-white fragment, once whispered to be locked within a black reliquary. He feared that such an artifact, if presented as divine proof in new lands, could create a church apart from Rome. A church that answered to knights, not popes. Imagine the terror this thought sparked. Europe was already fracturing. Reformers questioned indulgences. Kings pushed against papal authority. And the printing press scattered dangerous ideas like wildfire. Now add this: the possibility that the bone of God had been carried west, and that one day it might be revealed not in Rome, but in a temple under new stars. And so the Vatican did what it always did best. It watched. Agents were dispatched to Portugal, hidden eyes among dockworkers, confessors, even shipwrights. They listened not for gold or trade, but for stories of a chest of dark wood, or of sailors who prayed not to the Virgin, but to a fragment of bone wrapped in crimson cloth. Did they ever find it? If they did, no record survives in the open archives. Perhaps it was buried in the locked drawers of the Inquisition, filed away with other secrets deemed too explosive for public eyes. But even silence can be a kind of evidence. Because what's more likely? That the Vatican ignored such rumors? Or that it buried them deep enough to keep us wondering, even centuries later? In Portugal, silence was an art the knights had mastered. By the 15th century, the Order of Christ had replaced the Templar name, but the heart of their brotherhood remained the same. Their fortress in Tamar rose like a watchtower of stone and secrecy, its walls carved not only with crosses, but with hidden symbols. Serpents curling around stars, knots that seemed to have no beginning or end, and arches angled so that at certain hours of sunlight they threw the shadow of a chalice. Among these walls, the relic was never spoken of directly. The knights referred to it as Odam, the gift. To outsiders, the phrase meant nothing. To those inside the circle, it was a reminder that the most dangerous treasure in Christendom did not shine with gold or jewels, but lay wrapped in layers of cloth and silence. Voyages began to depart from Lisbon under the banners of Prince Henry the Navigator. Officially, these ships searched for trade routes and lands yet unmapped. Unofficially, some captains carried instructions written not in ink, but in code. "Sail west," one note read, "until the stars lean closer. There you will find the place where silence is stronger than memory." Historians debate whether this was metaphor or direction, but in the context of the relic, the meaning sharpens. The ocean was their vault, and distant shores their lock. In Tamar's convent, the knights practiced a ritual as the ships departed. At night, cloaked figures gathered around a black reliquary, its lid carved with interwoven circles. They did not pray aloud, but whispered phrases barely louder than breath. "Guard the gift, guard the lineage, guard the silence." Then, with torches extinguished, the reliquary was hidden again, its location known only to the master and 2 chosen deputies. Meanwhile, the Vatican's agents grew restless. Reports filtered back that the Order's sailors charted seas no Italian or Spanish ship had yet crossed. There were whispers of land beyond the horizon, places where the relic might be carried, beyond the hand of any pope or king. And if such a voyage succeeded, the relic would not only survive, it would be reborn, reshaping faith under stars Rome did not own. The brilliance of the Order's strategy was simple. They made the relic invisible by surrounding it with noise. Maps, ships, trade, spices, gold, all the spectacle of exploration concealed the one cargo that mattered most. Who would suspect that beneath crates of pepper and silks, a fragment of bone lay hidden, protected not by armies, but by silence? And here's where I want to ask you. Imagine standing on those docks in Lisbon. The wind is sharp with salt. The sails stretch against the night sky. You see barrels, ropes, chests, and you know that inside one of them is something the Vatican would kill to recover. If it were you, would you place your trust in the ocean, or would you bury it in stone? Not everyone in Lisbon looked toward the sea with wonder. In the narrow alleys near the docks, where taverns stank of wine and sailors' sweat, another kind of watcher waited. They were not knights, nor merchants. They were scribes, priests, and paid informants. Eyes of Rome, trained to spot whispers carried too far. The Vatican had grown suspicious of Portugal's sudden wealth and confidence. It was not only trade that blossomed, it was something less tangible, a sense of destiny clinging to the order of Christ. Too many voyages returned with more than spices. They returned with knowledge, star maps, strange symbols, and tales of a gift guarded with reverence that no sailor could fully explain. One report, smuggled back to the Curia in Rome, claimed, "They worship an unseen relic, not with candles or incense, but with silence itself. I cannot say what it is, but it terrifies them more than it comforts." The letter was marked urgent and locked in the Pope's archive, under seal. Agents began slipping into Tomar disguised as pilgrims. They lingered near the convent, sketching its windows, its tower, its odd geometry. One friar, in a coded confession, described hearing the words, "Bone of God," whispered during a midnight vigil. The Vatican seized on the phrase like fire catching straw. If such a relic existed, if Christ's own remains were in the hands of knights sworn to secrecy, it would shake the foundations of the Church itself. But Portugal was clever. The knights had learned centuries earlier in Jerusalem that spies hear best when they believe they are winning. So they fed the Vatican morsels of falsehood, decoys, staged processions, Empty reliquaries paraded through the city. The agents scribbled furiously, convinced they were circling the truth, when in fact, they were chasing shadows. Still, one name surfaced in Rome's reports again and again: the Navigator. Prince Henry's obsession with voyages, his patronage of the Order of Christ, his private chapel filled with maps marked in symbols no one could decipher. All of it pointed toward a single suspicion. The relic was not in Tomar at all. It was already on the ocean. And if that were true, the Vatican faced a nightmare. A relic they could neither control nor destroy, drifting further from their grasp with each tide. Now pause and picture this, because I want you to feel it, not just hear it. Imagine you're a Vatican agent, standing in a crowded Lisbon square. The bells are ringing, the crowd cheers as a fleet unfurls its sails. Somewhere on those ships, hidden beneath ropes and barrels, lies the bone said to carry the breath of God. You have one chance to stop it, but you don't know which ship, which chest, or which hand holds the key. Would you act, or would you let the ocean swallow the secret forever? The Atlantic was not kind to wooden ships. Even the bravest sailor whispered prayers when the wind shifted without warning, when the sky darkened with clouds so black it felt like night had fallen at noon. And on one such voyage, a fleet carrying spices, charts, and one chest unlike any other found itself at the mercy of a storm. Waves struck like walls, lifting the ships and slamming them down again. Masts cracked, sails shredded, and water poured into the hulls. Among the crew, panic grew, not from the storm alone, but from what they believed rode with them. Hidden in a reinforced chest, sealed in layers of waxed cloth and iron bands, was the relic, the fragment of bone the knights called Ossum Domini. Men swore they heard it hum in the dark of the hold. Not a voice, not a sound of wood or iron, but a vibration that seemed to travel through their bones. A young sailor collapsed, clutching his chest, gasping that the relic was breathing. Another shouted that it glowed faintly when lightning split the sky. The commander barked orders, forcing them back to their posts, but even he avoided looking at the chest too long. As the storm worsened, one ship broke apart on the reef, swallowed by the sea. Survivors claimed later that before the vessel sank, its captain tried to hurl the relic into the waves, believing it cursed. But the knights aboard fought him back, swords drawn even as the ship groaned and tore apart beneath them. The chest was wrestled onto a lifeboat, lashed down as men rowed furiously through the chaos. By dawn, only 2 ships survived, battered and broken, limping toward Madeira. The chest was still with them, drenched, heavy but unbroken. The sailors who touched it swore it was warmer than the sea around them. And here's the question I want you to sit with. If you were one of those men, soaked, half dead from the storm, staring at this strange relic that refused to sink, would you see it as holy protection or as proof of a dangerous blasphemy? Because in that moment, the Templars had to decide. To them, keeping the relic was not just about faith. It was about survival. If the Church ever seized it, their entire order, reborn in Portugal, might be undone in a single stroke. So they chose silence. The relic was hidden once more, its story buried under salt, fear, and the roar of the sea. But whispers carried. Survivors talked, and in Rome, rumors of a relic that refused to drown only fed the Vatican's hunger to seize it. 3 days after the storm, when the decks still smelled of brine and broken pitch, dark sails appeared where no friendly flag should be. Low to the water, fast, with a rake that promised teeth. Corsairs. The surviving Portuguese ships beat to quarters, but canvas shredded by the tempest made them lame birds. Within an hour, the lead corsair had her grapnels on the rail, and men with curved blades vaulted over like shadows. The boarding was quick and almost bloodless. No heroics, just the sick rhythm of surrender. The corsair captain, a narrow man with rings in each ear and a prayer knot at his wrist, walked the deck as if it already belonged to him. He greeted the Portuguese commander politely, almost warmly, and asked for the manifests. Spices? Fine. Cloth? Good. Charts? Interesting. And then his eyes fell on the reinforced chest. Iron-banded, wax-sealed, the only cargo lashed to the deck with a sailor's careful tenderness. "What's this?" he asked. No one answered. The wind made a low sound in the rigging. Somewhere a rope creaked like a throat trying to swallow. The Portuguese commander, a knight of the Order of Christ in a salt-stained surcoat, tried a simple lie. "Navigation instruments. Delicate," the corsair smiled. "Then we will handle them with prayer." He signaled. Two men stepped forward with chisels. Here is where the sea favors nerves over numbers. A senior pilot, gray-bearded, steady-eyed, moved between the chest and the corsairs with the calm of a man about to order a sail trimmed. He spoke in a tone barely above conversation. "Captain, open that and you'll have the plague on your deck by nightfall." He nodded toward the wax seal, where salt and heat had produced a faint odor, tallow and something sweet, medicinal. "It's a reliquary from an old chapel, sealed after a fever. If you break that wax without lit charcoal and vinegar, the miasma will take half your crew." He did not raise his voice. He did not blink. The corsair captain watched him for a long, narrow moment. Sailors are the most practical people in the world and the most superstitious. He jerked his chin. One of his men leaned in toward the seal, sniffed, recoiled. "Like a sick room," the man muttered. A second corsair, younger, touched the iron band and flinched as if it were warm. "It hums," he whispered, surprised to hear his own voice. The captain crouched, ran a thumb across the wax, and looked up with a new interest. Less greed, more curiosity. "If it is a reliquary, open it," he said. "With your charcoal and your vinegar, I will watch." It was a clever counter. The pilot had not expected to be called. The Portuguese commander almost smiled. This was a game they had practiced. A brazier was brought, and a small pot of vinegar from the galley. The pilot lit the charcoal, closed his eyes a moment like a man saying grace, and held a twist of cloth over the fumes. He worked slowly, reverently, lifting a corner of wax as if peeling back a scab from a beloved wound. The corsairs leaned nearer, caught between hunger and dread. Inside the first layer, another cloth, crimson, tight wrapped and bound by cord with a simple knot, the kind a monk could tie in the dark. The pilot paused, murmured a prayer that could have been Latin or simply breath, and touched the knot with 2 fingers. He did not undo it. Instead, he drew the cloth gently aside, just far enough to show a dark inner lid of oiled wood stamped with a shallow sigil, a cross fleury surrounded by a ring of dots. Ordinary to anyone, unmistakable to a Templar eye. "Holy remains," the pilot said, "of a martyr, not to be disturbed outside a chapel." He looked up without pleading, just the slight weariness of a man who has said this before. "Take the pepper, take the silk, leave this to God." The corsair captain stood. He was no fool. Relics could be ransom. They could also be poison. Political, spiritual, literal. He had seen crews sicken after raiding a plague port. He had seen a mutiny because a fisherman swore a bone in a box blinked at him in the moonlight. And there was something else. The crew's mood. You can feel when men are sliding toward fear. A captain who pushes past that fog risks losing more than cargo. So he stepped back and changed the question. "Give me your charts," he said. The Portuguese commander hesitated just long enough to make the request feel like a victory. They surrendered copies, coastal outlines, currents, wind notes, decent, useful, not the good ones, not the map with the star scribbles and the pilgrim's cross buried in the margins. That remained hidden under a false plank, dry as truth. Before leaving, the corsair made one last test. He told a young sailor, his most fearless, to lift the chest 3 fingers from the deck, a small, impossible ask. Heavy, waterlogged, iron-banded, the boy bent, grunted, and froze. "It moves," he said, baffled, as if weight had shifted inside without sound. The captain's eyes narrowed. He waved the boy off. He touched his prayer knot, then, almost apologetically, touched the wax again with one ringed finger, as if to confirm it was real. "Keep your plague," he said at last. "Keep your bones and your God." The grapnels were cast off. The corsair sheared away with spice and cloth and the sweetness of an almost win. The Portuguese stood very still until the black sails shrank to stitches against the horizon. Only then did they breathe. The pilot replaced the crimson cloth, pressed the softened wax back into its groove, and made a new seal with a seal stamp he wore on a thong at his neck. The mark it left was simple, a cross that to most meant Christ, to a few meant something older, oaths sworn in a round church on a hill in Jerusalem. That night, with lanterns hooded, the commander and the pilot sat by the chest. They did not speak for a long time. Then the commander said lightly, "When you told him the miasma would take half his crew, did you believe it?" The pilot smiled without showing teeth. "I believed it would take them if they believed it," he said. "On the sea, faith and fear sail under one flag. If you'd been on that deck, soaked rope under your palms, salt drying on your lips, and watched a man decide not to open a thing that might change the world, what would you have felt? Relief? Frustration? Awe? The truth is, history often turns on moments like this. A captain's caution, a pilot's calm lie, a superstition stronger than greed. And somewhere in Rome, a clerk would later scratch a note into a ledger, boarded off Madeira, took spice, left chest. A small line that meant a continent's worth of questions stayed unanswered. By dawn, they were underway again, riding a kinder wind. The chest, lashed and quiet, seemed only wood and iron. But the men who had heard it hum kept their distance, and the commander, who had not, found himself listening all the same. The river brought them home. After Madeira, after the corsairs, after the long hush of days when no one spoke above a murmur near the lashed chest, the 2 battered naus slipped up the Tagus at first light. Lisbon rose in layers, quays creaking with moored boats, warehouses with their whitewashed faces, and above them the castle on the hill, a tooth against the pale sky. Bells rang, low, practical bells for dock hands and market stalls, and the smell of tar, oranges, and salt slipped into every breath. On the aft deck, the commander of the Order of Christ stood with the pilot who had told the miasma lie and saved a war. They said nothing as the harbor pilot climbed aboard and took the tiller, but their eyes tracked the same thing. A royal barge already oaring toward them, scarlet pennons just catching the morning breeze. No delay then. No chance to hide. Word traveled faster than wood. On the quayside, royal officers waited with the polite aggression of men who get paid to look unconcerned. They bowed just enough, asked for the manifests, and asked, almost as an afterthought, that a single item be offloaded under guard. "A chest," the officer said, reading from a note. "Iron-banded, wax-sealed." He did not look up to see if it landed. It did. They did not take the chest to a warehouse or the Order's own house in Tamar. They took it to the Alcazaba, the royal fortress above the city, where the wind always seemed to carry a taste of iron and judgment. Stone corridors swallowed footsteps. Tapestries showed hunting scenes where the animals seemed to watch with human eyes. A clerk with ink on his fingers and the pale look of a man who had slept badly led them to a chamber of moderate size but great silence. By the window stood the king. Joan II did not need a crown to look like a reckoning. He was not tall, but he had the kind of stillness that pulls a room around it. His hands were clean, his gaze cleaner. Beside him, almost in the shadow, stood a man the commander recognized from rumor more than face, Rui de Paina, the royal chronicler who would later write what the king wished the world to remember. "Welcome home," the king said. His voice could have been kind. "You met a storm, and you met company." "Yes, senor," the commander said, "and yet you kept this." The king glanced at the chest, which two soldiers had set gently in the center of a carpet, woven with knots that repeated and repeated like a prayer. "You kept it when a captain might have thrown it over, and when a corsair might have claimed it." His eyes returned to the commander's face. "What is it?" The pilot began to answer with the calm words they had practiced. The king lifted a hand. "I did not ask what you call it," he said. "I asked what it is." For a beat, no one breathed. Saints have had easier choices. The commander bowed his head just far enough to make honesty feel like reverence. "A reliquary," he said, "sealed under vows, to be opened only in a chapel, at the direction of our prior, with incense and charcoal." The words were true. They were also a fence. "Vows," the king said, tasting the word. "Yours to whom?" "Christ," the commander said, and the room seemed to hear the capital letter. "And to the rule under which we serve?" "The rule you inherited," the king said mildly, "from men whose order I allowed to live by another name." He turned to the chronicler. "Master Rui, write that I respect vows." Then, after a quiet heartbeat, "Also write that vows do not outrank the good of the realm." He stepped closer to the chest. The wax seal made a dull, pretty shine in the thin light. The king touched nothing. "If I order this opened," he said, "and it is nothing, a saint's rib, a merchant's scam, you lose nothing but mystery. If I order it opened, and it is something, and it falls into the wrong hands, we lose more than money. Faith is a sail, Commander. It fills or it tears. I would prefer it full." The commander chose his one narrow path. "Majesty, may I speak as a servant and a son?" Joan II lifted an eyebrow. "You may." "The sea saved this chest 3 times, the commander said. "In a gale that broke ships like toys, in a boarding where fear could have slit it open, and in the harbor where rumor could have dragged it into the street. Each time we were given just enough space to keep our vow. I cannot say what is inside with more certainty than this. If it is holy, you do not want it turned into spectacle. If it is ordinary, you do not want your name on the page that made it foolish. Allow us to treat it as what it must be, sacred until proven otherwise, in Tomar, under our chapel roof, with you present if you wish." The chronicler's quill slowed, then stopped. The king regarded the commander as if he were a map he had not seen before. Familiar lines, unexpected coasts. He looked to the pilot. "And you? Will you stake your life on this man's piety?" The pilot met the king's gaze. "I already have," he said simply. "Twice in one storm." Silence ticked across stone. Outside, a gull cried, a bright, ordinary sound you only notice when you are waiting for something heavier. Juan II turned his head slightly. At that imperceptible cue, a third figure stepped from behind a screen. A Dominican, black and white habit crisp, hands folded like bridges. He had the thin smile of a man who has worn patience as a weapon. "Father Martinho," the king said, "you heard." "I did, Majesty," the friar said. His Portuguese carried a Rome edge. "If this chest contains a common relic, we can verify and venerate. If it contains a dangerous pretense," his eyes, clear and hard, rested on the seal, "we must extinguish it before it burns minds." "And if it contains neither pretense nor common bone?" the king asked. "Then," the friar said gently, "it contains a test of loyalty." The commander did not look away. "Let the test be ours," he said. "In Tomar, in God's house, not a throne room." The king stared at the chest a long moment, as if listening for the hum the sailors had sworn to. If he heard it, none of us will ever know. He stepped back. "Very well," he said. "Under guard to Tomar. I will come when I am ready." He turned to the Dominican. "Father Martinho, you will go now." "And if they run?" the friar asked, almost pleasantly. "They will not," the king said, eyes still on the commander. "They know what happens to men who confuse the good of the realm with their private devotions." The audience was done. The soldiers lifted the chest with a care that was almost respect. In the corridor, the smell of wax seemed stronger, or perhaps that was the chamber's memory clinging to their clothes. The commander exhaled only when the river wind found them again. The pilot leaned close. "We bought a day," he said. "Maybe two," the commander answered. "If you were in that room, let me ask you quietly, would you have begged, argued, or lied? Or would you have done what he did? Tell the truth so plainly it sounded safer than a secret." Sometimes that is how a door opens, not with the right key, but with the right tone. By dusk, the procession was moving north. Horsemen, a cart, 2 monks with travel chalices wrapped in cloth, and a Dominican who never stopped watching. The road to Tamar ran through cork and pine, past fields whose stubble made the land look like a book written in short lines. Somewhere behind them, in a high room of stone, a king considered what a chest could undo. Not a government, but a story. And if a realm is a sail, as he said, then stories are the wind. By noon, the road to Tamar had flattened into long ribbons of dust, the kind that clings to boots and thoughts alike. Cork oaks lifted their dark hands against a white sky. Storks nested on ruined towers like scribes who never left their desks. The cart with the iron-banded chest rolled between 2 riders at all times, wheel rims ticking a dull, steady metronome for men who tried not to count. Father Martinho did not ride at the front or the back. He drifted like a shadow between files, speaking softly, never long, leaving behind the faint, clean scent of monastery soap and the harder, invisible fragrance of judgment. He asked names the way a locksmith tries keys. He asked where each man had been during the storm, starboard, port, on his knees, on his feet. He asked what hymns they sang when the mast cracked, and whether anyone felt a warmth from the chest that could not be blamed on the press of bodies. He never raised his voice. He never accused. He simply collected. At a wayside chapel of limewash and nettles, they stopped to water the horses. The commander and the pilot drank from the same skin and spoke with their eyes alone. The Dominican stepped beneath the chapel's low arch and lit a candle, as if to pay the toll of a prayer. When he returned, he held a small brass balance, the kind money changers use to humble coins. "Indulge me a curiosity," he said, with a smile that would have been kind if it had not been so clean. He motioned to the cart. "If you will permit, we place the chest on the scale with the stones I have brought. We weigh it now. We weigh it in Tomar. Should God allow any tampering, the number will confess." The commander answered with courtesy drilled into bone. "The chest does not leave the cart until our chapel receives it, Father." "You heard the king," Martino said. He did not sound offended. He sounded patient. "What outranks vows is the good of the realm." "And who measures that?" the pilot asked too quickly. The Dominican's eyes warmed, like coals do when a bellows breathes. "We do, my son. Those of us who answer to Rome, which is to say, to the church that taught your order to pray. But come, if you fear my stones, then watch this." He lifted a slip of silk, no wider than a ribbon. "I will not touch the seal. I will tie only around the iron bands, a witness of thread." He held up both hands, palms empty, habit sleeves falling back to reveal forearms pale as paper. "A mercy for your nerves." The commander considered. It was not a trap, he recognized. And yet, every trap worth fearing begins as something you do not recognize. He shook his head once. "In Tamar," he said. "Everything in Tamar." The Dominican sighed, as if a student had chosen the longer lesson. "Very well, but allow me this. And I give you my word I will not ask again until we stand under your roof." He crouched by the wheel and set on the cart bed a little wad of pale wax, cheap altar wax, thumb-tested and softening in the heat. He pressed a hair into it, one he plucked from his own head with a theatrical wince, and flattened it all with his seal ring, a plain Dominican device, a star and cross. "There," he said, squinting in satisfaction. "If the chest shifts, the wax will crack. You keep the ring impression in your eye. I keep it in mine." The commander nodded. This was theater, but theater has its uses. He let it stand. They rode on. By late afternoon, the towers of Tomar rose like a chord. Square keep, round charola, the long shoulder of cloister walls. The Nabon River made a patient sound below. Mill wheels turned with the serenity of things that never change their minds. Boys carrying baskets stared at the small procession, then made themselves look busy, because men in habits and red crosses meant the day had become more serious than bread. At the gate, the orders porter rang a bell and crossed himself. Twice. Once for the rule, once for whatever this was. Inside, familiar stone received unfamiliar tension. The cart's wheels thumped onto the cloister flagging. Their echo clambered up columns braided with carved ropes and leaves. In the Corolla, the old Templar round church, the painted saints looked down with the unfazed expressions of those who have seen worse and better. The prior waited in the sacristy, a man whose beard had gone white in a tidy, cooperative way. He embraced the commander without ceremony. The commander rested his forehead against the older man's shoulder an instant longer than custom allowed, and no one pretended not to notice. "You did not lose it," the prior murmured. It sounded like you did not lose yourself. They set the chest on a trestle table beneath an iron sconce. The air smelled of cedar press, beeswax, and the old, damp breath of stone. Father Martino stepped in and bowed, deferent almost, as one professional to another. "Reverend Prior," he said, "by the king's instruction, I stand as witness, nothing more." He paused just long enough to make the next words land. "Unless what we see requires something more." The prior nodded, as though accepting a guest at supper who might or might not stay the night. "You will see nothing tonight," he said. "We fast, we pray, we sleep. In the morning, we open." "Fasting will not make a bone less false," the Dominican said gently. "No," the prior replied, "but it will make us less foolish." A monk entered with a brazier and swung it, not for smoke, but for warmth. The day had cooled faster than the eye could account for. The commander noticed then what the Dominican had noticed at the key. Small things become large when a room holds its breath. The hammer marks in the iron bands looked deeper. The wax seal looked glossier. Or perhaps his eyes wanted it to. Martino stepped closer than the commander liked, then stopped, as if arrested by courtesy. "For tonight," he said, "one request. Choose 6 men, your men and mine, to sleep in this room. 2 wake each watch. And give me leave to question your brothers, one by one, without your commander present." The prior's silence was the kind that counts to 10 inside. "You will not break them," he said at last. "I have no need," the Dominican replied, folding his hands. "If God is in this chest, I cannot. If God is not, I should not. I am only here to see who trembles when no one is looking." They agreed on watches. They agreed on nothing else. The questioning began in a side cell with a barred window that showed a slice of moon like a nail clipping. Martino asked the youngest sergeant first, because fear ripples outward from the boys. He asked of storms, of hymns, of warmth felt or imagined. He asked who first touched the seal after the boarding and whether anyone prayed to the chest, not to God. He offered neither threats nor absolutions. He offered a cup of water every time a man's voice caught, and if the water steadied him or made him shake, the friar noticed. When the pilot's turn came, the Dominican set the brass balance on the table and did not use it. "You lied at Madeira," he said conversationally. "A good lie to buy time. Will you lie here, where time is about to run out?" "I will not," the pilot said. "Because you fear sin more than your king?" Martino asked. "Because I fear God more than both," the pilot said. Then, after a beat, "and because I fear your pen most of all." The friar's smile reached his eyes this time. "Wise," he said. "You understand the realm." Near midnight, in the sacristy, the commander found the prior kneeling on the stones without a cushion. The old man's hands rested palm up on his knees, as if he were waiting for weight. "We will open it," the commander said, and did not know if he meant promise or threat. "We will open it," the prior agreed, "not because a king commands or a friar insists, because we asked God to choose the day. And he did." Outside, a night wind ran its fingers through the cypress, and the rope-carved columns kept their braided counsel. The wax on the iron bands did not crack. The little brass balance sat in the Dominican's cell, empty, like a question that would be asked at dawn. If you were there, cold stone under your knees, warm breath fogging in a halo when you exhaled, would you pray for the chest to be empty and your life simple, or full and your world forever complicated? Dawn was coming either way. Dawn came the way truth sometimes does, quietly on the soles of bare feet. A thin wash of pearl light slid down the round walls of the corolla and pooled on the stones. Breath showed in little ghosts. Somewhere in the cloister, a sleepy bell counted the hour like a hand tapping a table. Once, twice, thrice. The prior stood first. He did not speak. He pressed his palm to the stone for a heartbeat, as if borrowing calm from the building, and nodded to the commander. 2 sergeants lifted the chest from the trestles and set it on low blocks before the altar, iron bands facing outward. The wax blob with the Dominican's hair and seal mark sat exactly as it had the night before. Dull, unimpressed, whole. Father Martinho checked it. He did not touch. He leaned, eyes narrowing until the world became only that thumbprint and the tiny strand caught in it. Then he stepped aside. "It is as we left it." "Then we begin," said the prior. No oration, no pageantry. The commander crossed himself, took up a chisel warmed near the brazier, and set it against the first iron band. The struck metal rang like a small bell and startled sparrows in the high rafters. One band, another, the sound repeated, patient, workmanlike, until the last ring lay on the floor like a serpent asleep. He rested the chisel and, with both hands, lifted the lid. Cedar sigh. Linen. A darker smell under it, old beeswax, old oil, a note of something spicy and clean, as if someone had crushed a bay leaf a long time ago, and time had learned it by heart. The prior pulled back the first layer of cloth and revealed a wooden tray divided into two long channels. In one lay a cylinder of horn clasped with bronze, the surface scratched by travel and years. In the other rested a crystal reliquary no larger than a man's palm, mounted in modest silver. It held plainly a single bone, thin, smooth, with both ends rounded like a bead of light, one of the small bones of the hand. No one spoke. It is surprising what silence can hold. Father Martinho looked first not at the bone, but at the clasp. He has the senses of a scribe, the commander thought. Trains his eyes on the hinges of things. Gently, the prior opened the horn tube and slid out a roll of parchment wrapped around a sliver of purple silk. The parchment had the soft crackle that comes when fibers have been wrung dry by decades. The purple was faded to the color of plums at dusk. The Dominican did not pounce. He waited while the prior unrolled the narrow strip over a clean board. Ink, brown now, held lines that were older than anyone in the room and still unafraid. The script slanted like reeds in a steady wind. Greek letters. The prior's thumb hovered above them, reading without touching. Iakovu, Adelphu, Tukiriu. He breathed the words more than he said them. Then, more softly still, in Latin the room could understand, James, brother of the Lord. The commander looked from parchment to crystal, then to the prior. "Not," he began, and found there were too many ways to end the sentence or none at all. Father Martinho stepped closer at last. He did not question the Greek. He read it too. A careful man, he moved his gaze to a narrower strip of papyrus pinned beyond with tiny threads of wax. Latin this time, a later hand, tighter. Os Domini, ex Hierosolyma. Bone of the Lord, from Jerusalem. His mouth made a small, private shape. Dominus, he said, as if he were tutoring a novice and not warning a court. Can be the Lord in the highest sense. It can also be our Lord in the sense of a bishop, a prince, a revered one. The Church has more than one Lord in her stories. The prior nodded. And James, he touched the air above the Greek again, was called brother of the Lord by the first believers. Close blood, closer belief. If a relic were sent from Jerusalem to be kept safe, his bone would not be a strange choice. And yet, Martinho added, eyes now on the reliquary, you sailed this through storms and swords, under a name men died for. You used the highest word. He did not accuse. He arranged the facts on the table and let the room see how they sat together. The crystal caught the thin light and made a pale flare on the ceiling. The commander felt how a room can tilt without moving. For months at sea, it had been easier to imagine a miracle or a fraud. This was neither. This was a thing that asked to be carried carefully through language. "Father," the pilot said, his voice low, worn by salt, reverent because the air required it. "Smell the linen." The prior lifted the next fold. A faint sweetness rose. The ghost of nard, maybe, or spikenard's cousin, the way books speak of perfume they've slept beside. "Oil?" The Dominican reached out, then pulled his hand back and turned his palm up to be seen before he touched. "By your leave." "By God's," the prior said. Martinho's fingers were precise and almost tender. He dabbed at the edge of the cloth, brought his fingertips to his nose, waited. "Old anointing oil," he said at last. "Not a trick a day old. A tradition a century old or more. Perhaps many more." The king's notary, who had entered quietly and stood like an extra shadow behind a pillar, coughed into his hand, and because it was his work to chew hard knots into smaller ones, asked the question that puts men back into time. "What shall I write, Reverend Fathers?" The prior looked to the commander. The commander looked to the Dominican. A long moment that weighed hearts like coins. Then the prior spoke, slow, as if he laid a plank between two cliffs. "You will write, 1 bone, small, in crystal and silver, accompanied by a label in Greek that reads, 'Of James, brother of the Lord,' and by a later Latin note that reads, 'Bone of the Lord, from Jerusalem.'" "Shall I capitalize Lord?" the notary asked, the way men ask how much spice goes into a recipe that can burn a village. "You will write Domini in the hand you would use for a bishop," the prior said, "so that Rome can read comfort if comfort is needed, and wonder if wonder is given." Father Martinho drew a slow breath. He had come, the commander realized, to trap them in a dangerous claim, or to strip them of a precious one. What he found instead was a road through the middle, a way to honor the thing without wrecking the city it passed through. The Dominican inclined his head, not as victor, not as judge, but as a craftsman recognizing another's steady hand. "I will add," he said, "that the vessel and cloth appear of venerable age, that no fraud was evident to the senses permitted to me, that the chest was guarded without sleep and opened after fasting and prayer in the presence of witnesses named below." "And then?" the pilot asked, because ships like orders and he needed one now. "And then," the prior said, "we will do the safest, most faithful thing." He lifted the reliquary, and for a moment that seemed longer than it was, the bone hovered in both church and history. Small, homely, as human as the curve of a knuckle, and as freighted as a crown. He set it on the altar and covered it with the purple silk. "We enthrone it as a relic of the Jerusalem church. We will call it Relic of the First Brotherhood. We will venerate it for what it surely is, a piece of the body of one who stood so near the Lord that language blurs. We will not claim beyond what we can carry." "And if the king asks," Martinho said, almost kindly, "the king will receive what kings have always received from monks," the prior answered. "A true report, and a title that saves his soul from a harder sin." The men exhaled. It was not relief, it was landing. They resealed the chest with fresh bands, not to imprison mystery, but to let it travel with its own gravity. This time the seal pressed into the wax was not the Dominican star, but the order's cross. Iron biting soft white with the finality of a signature. The notary's pen made its scratching river sound. The sun found its way through the clear story and turned the floating dust into a gentle congregation. Before they left the church, the prior did what abbots do when the world has brought more weight than a room was built to bear. He made the story smaller and truer. He gathered the men, placed their hands, Dominicans too, on the cool altar edge, and prayed only this: Lord, keep us faithful to what we have seen. Keep us merciful with what we have not. Outside, Tomar was awake. Mills chattered, bread cracked. A child laughed near the fountain as if all mornings were the same. Inside, the record dried. The silk hid its small hill, and the men who had opened the chest carried a new kind of silence in their ribs. Then one spring, long after the first witnesses had been buried with the same ordinary honors given to bakers and masons, a scholar from Coimbra sat in the sacristy with the ledger and the theca. He had soft hands and honest eyes, and asked the prior's permission to dab a linen thread with a dampened swab, no more, no less, to test for the old oils. The prior, who knew that faith and clean methods can be friends, agreed. The report came back with humility and a small, welcome clarity. Traces consistent with ancient unguents used in funerary or anointing rites of the Eastern Mediterranean. It proved nothing too large. It confirmed nothing too small. Sometimes that's exactly the shape of truth we can carry. By then, the story had done its deeper work on the men who lived under it. It had taught them the difference between guarding a claim and guarding a trust. It had taught them that a capital letter can warm a rumor without adding a single gram of holiness to a thing. It had taught them to let a relic name itself slowly, by the lives it changed, not by the trophies it earned. If you stand in the Corolla on a quiet afternoon, tour groups gone, a verger mopping his way toward the door, you can still feel how a place accumulates carefulness. The round drum holds sound like a bowl holds water. You might hear a novice practicing the antiphon of St. James, the notes tentative at first, then finding their step. You might hear someone kneel. You might hear your own breathing soften to the pace of people who understood that haste is not a sacrament. Was it James's bone? Perhaps. Was it the Lord's? Not for me to say, and not for those men either, who chose instead to keep the thing whole for the next hands. What they gave us, more precious than a verdict, is a pattern. Open what comes to you with fasting and witnesses. Write down exactly what you see. Leave the capital letters to God. Protect the object from your ambition and your fear. Call it by the most truthful name you can carry across a century. Maybe that's the real content of a forbidden relic. Not that it overturns everything, but that it asks you to live differently with what you can't prove and won't betray. Before we close, I'll ask you the one question those men kept asking themselves in different words. If you had been there when the wax cooled and the ink dried, would you have written Domini with the higher letter? Or kept it small and let humility do its quiet work? Tell me what you would have done and where you're listening from tonight. I read every comment. It helps me choose which door to open next, and it reminds me that, across oceans and time zones, we're still a kind of brotherhood, carrying small lights carefully through very large rooms.